5 buildings that should have been impossible. A skyscraper saved by a golden ball. The tallest thing humans have ever built. A pyramid with 105 floors and 0 guests. A church under construction since 1882. And a city that exists only as a render. All 5. Back to back. It weighs 660 tons. And it is the main reason the people inside don't feel sick. This is Taipei 101, and by all rights, it should not work. Taipei 101 rises 508 meters above the city of Taipei, 101 floors of glass and steel. When it was finished in 2004, it was the tallest building in the world. But Taiwan is one of the worst possible places to build something this tall. The island sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, shaken by constant earthquakes, and every year it is battered by some of the most powerful typhoons on the planet. A tower this tall in a place like this faces a brutal enemy: motion. Strong wind doesn't just push a skyscraper, it makes it sway, slowly, back and forth. High enough up, that sway can make people feel seasick, and over time it strains the entire structure. So how do you stop a quarter of a kilometer of steel from swaying? The engineer's answer was strange. They didn't try to make the tower perfectly stiff. Instead, they hung a pendulum inside it. Between the 87th and 92nd floors, they installed a tuned mass damper, a colossal sphere of solid steel built from 41 layers of plate and painted gold. It weighs 660 tons, and it hangs from 92 steel cables, each over 40 meters long. And here is the clever part. When the wind pushes the building one way, the giant ball, hanging freely, swings the opposite way. It fights the motion. As the tower leans one way, the pendulum pulls the other, canceling out the sway. Hydraulic pistons around the ball soak up the energy and turn it into heat. It is tuned so precisely that it keeps the top floors calm even in a violent storm, and it has been tested for real. The ball is designed to swing up to 1.5 meters. During Typhoon Soudelor, in 2015, it swung about 1 full meter, the largest movement in its history, and the building barely flinched. Today, that golden ball isn't hidden away. You can stand right next to it. It has become the icon of the entire tower, proof that sometimes the smartest way to beat a force of nature isn't to resist it, but to move with it. But a swinging ball is just one way engineers outsmart the invisible. Somewhere out there, a bridge was built so long that the curvature of the earth itself had to be designed into it. Rising out of the desert in Dubai is a tower so tall it seems to belong to a different scale of reality. It stretches more than 800 meters into the sky. From the top you can watch the sunset twice, once from the ground and again as you ride the elevator up. This is the Burj Khalifa. Was the verdict in the weight to wastes never who were even. Radium it's 828 meters tall. That is though amp it reads another net of data 100 Harriets and touching humans is tall, reaching higher than any structure humans have ever completed. When it opened in 2010, it didn't just break the record for the world's tallest building, it shattered it, leaving the previous Taipei 101 far below. Simply moving people up and down a tower like this is its own engineering feat. Its elevators are among the fastest in the world, racing upward at building decks in higher edge range can look crash in the town everything graphics and something else building elevator to live on a stale build it's not worlds and a battle in up that have never gone the Gillsbury it's not fair really about it really who the engineers were was understood headers son upgrade the time event to visitor it's for Naquime. The true enemy of a super tall building was something you cannot see set type bossing sort of get strong thing something worth quitting this higher to use hair move on. Here is the problem. Wind flows past tall and tower doesn't just push on it, it peels off the sides in swirling gusts called vortexes, and if those vortexes start shedding in a steady rhythm, they can shove the building back and forth, again and again, in time with its natural sway. Left unchecked, that rhythmic push can make a skyscraper oscillate violently. If that sounds strange, think of pushing a child on a swing. One random shove does almost nothing, but if you time your pushes to the swing's natural rhythm, it climbs higher and higher with hardly any effort. The wind can play that exact game with a skyscraper, if it is ever allowed to find the beat. And the taller and thinner the tower, the more dangerous that game becomes. For a tower as tall and slender as the Burj Khalifa, that shaking wouldn't just make people at the top feel seasick, it could threaten the structure itself. So the engineers at the firm SOM faced a defining question. How do you stop the wind from finding a rhythm to push against? Their answer was brilliant, and a little bit sneaky. They didn't try to simply overpower the wind with brute strength. Instead, they designed the tower to confuse it. The trick is hidden in the tower's shape. Seen from above, the Burj Khalifa is not a square or a circle. It is a Y, 3 wings reaching out from a strong central core. This is called a buttressed core. The central spine gives the tower its stiffness against twisting, while the 3 wings brace against each other and push back against the wind. That Y-shaped footprint was chosen specifically to break up the wind and make the tower easier to build at the same time. But the real magic is what happens as the tower climbs. The Burj Khalifa does not rise as a single straight shaft. As it goes up, it steps inward through a series of setbacks, spiraling around the building as it gets thinner and thinner toward the sky. And that spiraling shape is the key to defeating the wind. Because the tower is a slightly different shape at every height, the wind hits a different profile at every level. The swirling vortexes can never line up. They can never organize into one single powerful rhythm. Instead of a coordinated push, the wind is scattered into confusion. The tower quite literally refuses to give the wind anything steady to grab onto. To get this exactly right, the engineers didn't just guess. They built models of the tower and ran more than 40 separate wind tunnel tests, blasting the shape with air to study every gust and swirl. They kept refining the spiraling setbacks until the wind simply could not shake the building. They outthought the sky. And here is the counterintuitive part. The goal was never to make the tower perfectly rigid. A building this tall is meant to move, to flex gently with the wind rather than stubbornly resist it. The real triumph is not that the Burj Khalifa stands perfectly still. It is that it moves exactly as much as it should, and never more. But designing a tower this tall is only half the story. You still have to build it, in the middle of a desert, in punishing heat. And that created a problem almost as brutal as the wind. How do you get wet concrete hundreds of meters up into the air before it hardens? The answer was to pump it, higher than concrete had ever been pumped before. During construction, the crews forced concrete up through pipes to a record height of around 600 meters from the ground. To survive the journey and the heat, they used a special high-strength concrete, often poured at night when the desert was cooler, sometimes chilled with ice. The outside of the tower is wrapped in tens of thousands of glass panels, a shimmering skin built to bounce back the brutal desert sun and keep the heat outside. Simply cleaning that surface is a permanent job of its own, a small team of workers slowly making their way around the tower, hanging high above the city below. Beneath all of it, hidden underground, is the foundation that holds this giant steady. The tower sits on a massive slab of reinforced concrete, several meters thick. And that slab is supported by a forest of concrete piles driven deep into the ground, spreading the tremendous weight into the earth below. And right at the very top sits the tower's crowning needle, its spire. Rather than lifting it up the outside, the engineers assembled the spire inside the building and then jacked it upward into its final position from within, like a telescope extending toward the sky. That final piece pushed the Burj Khalifa to its full, record-breaking height. There is one more twist to the story, and it is written into the tower's very name. During construction, it wasn't called the Burj Khalifa at all. It was known as the Burj Dubai, but as it was being finished, a global financial crisis struck and Dubai needed help. Its neighbor, Abu Dhabi, stepped in. In gratitude, the tower was renamed in honor of the ruler of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Khalifa. So the name on the tallest building in the world is a permanent monument, not just to engineering, but to the moment one city reached out to rescue another. On a clear day, you can see that monument from nearly 100 kilometers away. Think about what this tower really represents. It is not just the tallest thing we have ever built, it is proof that the biggest challenges in engineering are often invisible, visible. The Burj Khalifa didn't conquer the wind by being stronger than it. It won by being smarter, by twisting its own body into a shape the wind could never quite understand. Some structures overpower nature. This one outwitted it, turning a deadly force of moving air into something harmless, just by changing its shape as it climbed. That is the difference between building tall and building brilliant. But not every megastructure reaches for the sky. Some of the most incredible engineering on Earth goes in the opposite direction, plunging deep beneath the sea. Somewhere out there, engineers dug a tunnel so far under the ocean that trains now race through the seabed itself. That is the next story. In the middle of Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, there is a pyramid. It is made of concrete and glass. It stands 330 meters tall, and it is one of the largest hotels ever designed. It has 105 floors. It has been standing, in one form or another, for almost 40 years. And in all that time, it has never had a single guest. Not one. This is the story of the tallest empty building on Earth. It is called the Ryugyong Hotel, and it was supposed to be a symbol of triumph. A gleaming tower to crown the capital and show the world what the country could build. Instead, it became something no one intended, a monument that spent decades unable to open its doors. The plan began in 1987. North Korea wanted a landmark, and it wanted it fast. The design was extraordinary, a slender pyramid rising to a sharp point, 330 meters above the city. 105 floors of hotel, reportedly around 3,000 rooms, topped by a cluster of revolving restaurants that would turn slowly high above Pyongyang. And there was a deadline. The hotel was rushed to be ready for a huge international event, the World Festival of Youth and Students, in the summer of 1989. This was a showcase, a chance to impress thousands of visitors from around the world, and to answer the attention that neighboring South Korea had just won by hosting the 1988 Olympics. On paper, it was ambitious in the extreme. A building this tall would have been a serious challenge for any country. For an economy the size of North Korea's, it was a staggering gamble. And the numbers behind it were enormous. By some estimates, the project would swallow a sum equal to around 2% of the entire national economy. That figure is not official, and it should be treated with caution. But everyone agrees the cost was crushing. The first problem was the deadline itself. 1989 came, the festival happened, and the hotel was nowhere near ready. The tower was rising, but it was an empty concrete frame, not a working building. And then the ground shifted underneath the whole project. In 1991, the Soviet Union, North Korea's most important ally and economic lifeline, collapsed. The support that had propped up the economy vanished almost overnight. A devastating famine followed later in the decade. And in that crisis, a luxury hotel was impossible. Around 1992, construction simply stopped. The cranes went still. And the Ryugyong was abandoned as a bare gray skeleton, 330 meters of unfinished concrete looming over the city. What happened over the next 16 years is where the legend grew, and it came on three fronts. The first was money, and it never really went away. The country simply could not afford to finish what it had started. So the tower just stood there, frozen, from 1992 all the way to 2008. For years, it was reportedly kept out of official photographs of the city, as if a building that big could be made to disappear. The second front was the structure itself. A building left half-finished and exposed to the weather for over a decade invites hard questions. For years, outside reports claimed the concrete was flawed, or that parts of the tower were slightly out of true. It is important to be careful here. Much of this was rumor, from a country that reveals almost nothing. But what is certain is that, for 16 years, no one could use it. The third front was isolation. A grand hotel only works if guests come. But North Korea was one of the most closed-off countries on Earth, wrapped in sanctions and cut off from the global tourism industry. There was no international hotel chain lining up to run it, and almost no foreign travelers to fill 3,000 rooms. The building's basic purpose had quietly stopped making sense. Then, in 2008, there was movement. An Egyptian company, Orascom, arrived to build the country's mobile phone network, and, as part of its work in North Korea, it took on the Ryugyong. Crews finally wrapped the raw concrete pyramid in glass panels. By 2011, the outside of the building was, at last, complete. From a distance, it finally looked like the tower from the original drawings. It looked finished. But it was a shell. Behind that glass, the interior was still largely empty. And that is where the Ryugyong found its strange second life. Because if it could not be a hotel, the state found another use for it. In 2018, workers fitted one enormous face of the pyramid with a giant LED display. Now, at night, the tallest unfinished building in the world lights up. It plays animations, waving flags, political imagery, scenes glorifying the state, projected across a screen the height of a skyscraper. The hotel that never opened had become a billboard. There have been flickers of a different future. In 2024, reporting suggested the state was quietly looking for foreign investors, even offering the rights to run a casino inside, anything to finally fit out those empty floors. Whether that ever happens is anyone's guess. As of 2026, the Ryugyong Hotel is still officially unopened. Guinness World Records lists it as the tallest unoccupied building on the planet. So, what is the Ryugyong, really? It is not quite a failure, and it is not a success. It is one of the largest structures ever built for a purpose it has never once served. For nearly 40 years, it has stood over Pyongyang. First, as a symbol of ambition, then as an embarrassing skeleton, and finally as a glowing screen, selling an image to the city below. It was designed to welcome the world. Instead, it just shows the world a picture. And that raises a strange question. When a building this enormous can never do the one job it was built for, what is it actually for? Maybe, in the end, the message was always the point. In February of 2026, workers in Barcelona lifted the final piece into place on top of a church tower. It was a cross, 17 meters tall, about the height of a 5-story building. And with it, the tallest church tower on Earth was topped out after 144 years of construction. The architect who designed it had been dead for a century. This is the story of the church that refused to be finished. This is the Sagrada Familia. And it was never meant to be an ordinary church. It was meant to be a Bible written in stone, the greatest cathedral of the modern age. The man who took on that dream would spend the rest of his life on it and still not come close to seeing it done. Construction began in 1882 as a fairly conventional Gothic church. Then, in 1883, a young architect named Antoni Gaudi took over, and he tore up the plan. Gaudi did not want to copy the great cathedrals of Europe. He wanted to build something that looked like it had grown out of the earth. His design was unlike anything in architecture. Towers like melting stone, columns that branch like trees, facades crawling with sculpture. When finished, the church would have 18 towers, and the tallest, the Tower of Jesus Christ, would rise 172.5 meters into the sky. That number was not chosen at random. Gaudi set the height deliberately just below the nearby hill of Montjuic, which stands about 177 meters. He believed that no work of human hands should ever rise higher than the work of God. So he designed his masterpiece to stop, on purpose, a few meters short. And there was one more radical choice: the money. The Sagrada Familia was built as what is called an expiatory temple. That means it would be funded entirely by donations, no government money, no royal treasury, just the coins and gifts of ordinary people, given slowly, over generations. It was a spectacular way to build a cathedral. It was also a guarantee that it would take a very, very long time. Gaudi knew he would never live to see it finished. He is said to have shrugged that off because, in his words, his client was not in a hurry. But no one expected the end to come the way it did. On the 10th of June, 1926, Gaudi was walking to church when he was struck by a tram on the Gran Via. He was badly hurt, and because he dressed plainly and carried almost no identification, the most famous architect in Spain was mistaken for a poor beggar. He was taken to a public hospital for the destitute. By the time anyone realized who he was, it was too late to save him. Gaudi died 3 days later, and at that moment, his impossible church was barely a fraction built. What happened next is why this building became a legend. And it came on 3 fronts. The first was the most brutal. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War tore through Barcelona, and the Sagrada Familia became a target. Anarchist militias broke into the site. They burned the crypt, they set fire to Gaudi's workshop, and they smashed his studio to pieces. And in doing so, they destroyed something irreplaceable. Gaudi had left behind detailed plaster models and drawings, the key to his entire vision. Much of it was burned and shattered in a matter of days. The instructions for finishing the church had, quite literally, gone up in flames. Which led to the second front. The people who came after had to rebuild the design itself before they could rebuild the church. For decades, architects and modelers pieced Gaudi's intentions back together from charred fragments, from surviving photographs, and from broken bits of plaster. Later, they would use computers to reconstruct the impossible geometry hiding inside his half-melted models. They were not just building a cathedral. They were reverse engineering a dead genius. And the third front was the one Gaudi had chosen himself: money and time. Because it ran only on donations, the work crawled for much of the 20th century. There simply was not enough to build faster. It was so far outside the normal rules that the Sagrada Familia was under construction for 137 years without an official building permit. The city only issued one in 2019. What changed everything, in the end, was people showing up. As the towers rose and the church became world famous, tourism exploded. Today, around 5 million visitors a year come through its doors. In 2025, that turned into more than 130 million euros of income, all of it private. A huge share of it poured straight back into construction. The crowds that came to see the unfinished church were the ones who finally finished it. And so, we arrive at 2026. In October of 2025, the Sagrada Familia quietly passed a church in Germany that had held a record since 1890 and became the tallest church in the world. Then, in February 2026, that 17-meter cross was lifted to the top of the Tower of Jesus Christ, and the structure reached its full height of 172.5 meters. In June, on the exact 100th anniversary of Gaudi's death, that tower was blessed by the Pope. But here is the part that often gets misreported. This did not finish the basilica. What was completed was the outside of its tallest tower. Inside it, work goes on. And around it, the grand glory facade, several of the apostle towers, a chapel, and parts of the cloister are all still unbuilt. By the builder's own reckoning, the church is only around 70% complete. Those final pieces are not expected to be finished until at least the 2030s. There is always one more piece, which, in a strange way, might be the most fitting thing about it. Gaudi built a church that was never really designed to be rushed, funded by the slow generosity of strangers, guided by a plan that was burned and then lovingly rebuilt from the ashes. It has outlived wars, dictators, and its own creator. So, maybe the real question the Sagrada Familia leaves us with is not when it will finally be finished. Maybe it is whether a building like this was ever meant to be built. In the desert of northwest Saudi Arabia, there is a construction site about 2.5 kilometers long. It was supposed to be a city stretching 170 kilometers straight across the country. 2 mirrored walls, each half a kilometer tall, holding 9 million people. What is actually there today is a strip of foundations in the sand. This is the story of the widest gap between a render and reality the world has ever seen. It is called the Line. And when it was unveiled, it was not pitched as a building. It was pitched as the future of how humans live. No cars, no streets, no carbon. A single structure, running in a perfectly straight line to the horizon. That was the promise. What happened next is a lesson in what money cannot buy. In 2021, Saudi Arabia announced the Line as the centerpiece of a plan called Vision 2030. The idea was to spend the country's oil wealth building something that would outlast oil itself. And the design revealed in 2022 was genuinely unlike anything ever proposed. Picture 2 buildings, side by side, each one 500 meters tall, taller than almost every skyscraper on Earth, each one running not for a block, but for 170 kilometers across the desert. The outside would be a wall of mirrored glass, reflecting the sky. Inside, between the two walls, an entire city. And the promises inside were just as bold. 9 million people, 0 cars, because you would never need one. Everything you required, within a 5-minute walk. And if you did need to cross the whole city, a high-speed rail line would carry you end to end in 20 minutes. All of it powered by the sun and the wind. A perfect, sealed, vertical world. The renders were stunning, and they went everywhere. Glowing walls at sunset, gardens hanging in the air, marinas built into the base of a skyscraper. For a while, the line felt less like a construction project and more like a piece of science fiction that someone had actually decided to fund. The estimates for that funding ranged from a few $100 billion to, by some analyses, more than $1 trillion. And then the reporting started to change. In April of 2024, Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal reported something that punctured the whole vision. The first phase of the line, they said, was being quietly cut, not trimmed, cut from 170 kilometers down to about 2.5. The population target told the same story. The plan to have 1.5 million people living there by 2030 was reportedly slashed to fewer than 300,000. Officially, Saudi Arabia pushed back. In public statements, it said all of its megaprojects would go ahead as planned. But the reported numbers and the cranes told a different story. The line was colliding with something the renders never showed. The cost. The replenishment of these, this first 300 vision, but the first was pure 25s of 2025 laureate to be on a leaked internal audit of the project. According to that audit, finishing the line as originally designed would cost around $8.8 trillion. It is worth sitting with that number. $8.8 trillion is more than double the entire annual budget of the United States government. The same leaked audit reportedly concluded the full city would not be finished until around 2080. The vision was not just expensive. On paper, it was a project that no single nation could actually afford to complete. The best complaint that really form-empowered being theoretical in Brown and inverse to 2025 was the future to the project be found about agent found the line water is sensible to the way to spend in the 2025 and wanting parents the mo revisited 20%. The project began to shrink the most visible way possible. Across Quasi 2020s and E5, 20 Neom, the wider zone the line sits inside, fell by around 70 cent. And in 2026, more than 1,000 staff were moved off the site itself and back to the capital, Riyadh, for what was described as centralized oversight. The desert was getting quieter, not busier. Then came the decision that made it official. In September of 2025, the Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund driving the whole thing, suspended construction on the line. Suspended. The single most ambitious building project ever announced put on hold, with its foundations barely out of the sand. And there is a harder part of this story, one the renders never included. The land the line was meant to cross was not empty. For centuries, it had been home to the Huitat tribe, some 20,000 people. Beginning in 2020, they were ordered to leave to make way for the project. According to human rights organizations, including the group ALQST and later United Nations experts, the evictions were forced. One man, Abdul Rahim al-Kuwaiti, publicly refused to go and filmed his refusal. In April 2020, those same organizations report, he was killed by security forces at his home. Others who resisted were arrested. Several received long prison terms, and rights groups reported that 3 men were sentenced to death. The city those families were moved for is the one now sitting suspended in the sand. So what is the line, really, in 2026? It is important to be precise because it has not officially been canceled. On the ground, what exists is roughly 2.5 kilometers valve, foundations, and earthworks, out of 170 kilometers. That is about 1.5% of the promised length, and not a single one of those 500-meter mirrored walls has risen above the desert floor. The official position is that the line is paused and rephased, not dead. And around it, some real infrastructure has been built, power and water systems. A separate industrial zone, a small luxury island resort that has actually opened. The wider project has produced tangible things. But the flagship, the vision that was sold to the world, the mirrored city for 9 million, now has a full completion date quietly pushed to 2045 at the earliest. Some independent analysts think the true figure, if it is ever finished at all, is closer to the 2070s or 80s. The line was meant to prove that with enough ambition and enough money, you could redesign the city itself from a blank sheet of desert. Instead, it may have proven the opposite, that some limits are not about vision or willpower. They are about physics and arithmetic, and the people who were already standing on the land. A render can promise anything. The desert only keeps what you can actually build. So the question the line leaves behind is not whether it was too ambitious. It is what it costs, in money and in lives, to find out that something was impossible all along. If this blew your mind, hit that like button and subscribe for more megastructures, and tell me in the comments which one I should cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.